Okay, here's a quick summary of Chapter 2. In Freud's psychoanalytic theory, he thought that personality was basically set by the time we're 5 to 6 years of age. But there was a lot of controversy about his theory, mainly because of what he believed about the psychosexual stages, which we'll talk about next. Freud thought that every person has conflicts that take place in the internal mind, unconscious mind. These conflicts have to do with cultural expectations and our own personal wants and drives, like sex or aggression. We all function in 3 different states: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is kind of like a spoiled brat kid, functioning under the principle of the pleasure principle and wanting immediate gratification. The ego is kind of like an executive, and it functions under the reality principle. So the ego balances the demands of the id, wanting things immediately, and the ideals of the superego. The superego is kind of like your conscience. The ego also balances what's possible in reality against what both the id and the superego are demanding. So Freud's psychosexual stages, that part of the theory, and also there are actually 2 periods as well, so 5 total stages and periods. This is where all the controversy really arises. Freud believed that during each stage or period, there's a specific erogenous zone on the body, and that's the focus for deriving pleasure. Everything except for the latency period has an erogenous zone. An inability to resolve the conflict of each of these stages can result in having a complex, which means that the person has chronic problems, or in fixation, and that means they're fixed in that stage. It's not possible, however, to be fixated in the genital stage, because that actually lasts for the whole rest of the adult life, or the genital period, rather. The first 3 stages are the most important. The oral stage is from birth to about 18 months, and the erogenous zones are the mouth, lips, and tongue. The conflict during this period is basically ending breastfeeding. Fixation in an adult might present with a smoker, someone who bites their nails a lot, is sarcastic, a chatterbox, or even a gum chewer. The anal stage is from 18 months of age to about 3 years of age, and that's right about when toilet training is occurring, so the conflict is learning how to control body functions, to both hold and release. Fixation can occur in a person who's either very sloppy or extremely uptight, and the expression anal retentive is still used today to describe someone that uptight. The phallic stage is between years 3 and 7, and that's when the focus is on the genitals. This is probably the highest controversial stage in Freud's theory. This is when boys and girls have to resolve either the Oedipal complex or the Electra complex. Oedipal complex is what boys have to resolve, and Electra is for girls. And Freud basically believed that with these complexes, a boy wants his mother sexually and fears dad's punishment and fears that his dad will actually castrate him. And then same with the girl, that a girl wants her father sexually and fears her mom's jealousy. Freud also believed that girls suffer from something he called penis envy, that they just want a penis. Fixation at this stage can be seen in terms of a person's attraction to people who are much like their opposite sex parent. So you've heard the expression daddy issues. Somebody with daddy issues might be fixated. The last 2 are called periods, and it's latency and genital. The latency period is from about 8 years of age until puberty starts. And basically nothing really happens. You're repressing your sexual urges, and most kids just play with their same-sex friends. But during the genital stage, that occurs with puberty during adolescence and lasts throughout the remainder of a person's life. So again, it's not possible to be fixated in the genital period. Freud's critics thought he was way too focused on what happens in early childhood. He only worked with adults too, so that's crazy. He was extremely focused on the person's relationship with mom. The phallic stage that I just went over with those Oedipal and Electra complexes was criticized widely. Freud also is blamed very often for refrigerator moms. That's an expression that was widely believed for a long time, that cold, hostile moms, refrigerator moms, are responsible for creating autism in their children. That has been disproven, but Freud tended to blame moms for a lot of problems. He also pretty much exclusively studied white Western culture men. But one of the things he really did contribute to the field was the understanding that we do have an unconscious. We're not aware of everything that's going on in our minds. He also talked about defense mechanisms, which are just protections that our minds allow us to do. Denial, projection, and displacement are all, I think, pretty commonly used. Denial, just like what you think when you deny that that lump might be breast cancer. Projection is when you project your own, unattractive emotion or behavior even onto someone else. Displacement would be when you displace your emotion onto the wrong object. So say you're mad at dad and then you go kick the dog. Freud also contributed by just inspiring additional research. Erikson was one of Freud's followers, and he was the first to develop a theory that went across the lifespan. He believed, unlike Freud, that personality does develop right up until death. His theory is called psychosocial. Social is important because he thought that we develop within a social world. Originally, he had 8 stages, but possibly there's a 9th stage. After he died, his wife published his work that added a 9th stage called wisdom transcendence, but most people just study the 8, and this is what's in your textbook that you see here. Erikson talked about resolving opportunities. He didn't see it as conflicts or crises like Freud did, but opportunities to grow. And here you see the 8 stages. A healthy personality occurs if a person is able to resolve all of these opportunities with good balance. In the first stage, trust versus mistrust, you obviously, as a baby, an infant, a newborn, you need to trust your caregivers. But you can't trust everybody in the world. That would be maladaptive. So again, good balance. Behaviorism, these guys came along when they really wanted to look at observable, measurable behaviors instead of thinking so much about what's unobservable going on in someone's mind. You can actually measure and look at a behavior. Classical conditioning is basically when you associate 2 stimuli together. And operant conditioning occurs when you associate a behavior with a consequence. These theories are also called learning theories because they focus so heavily on how we learn. Pavlov is a huge classical conditioning researcher. He was actually a doctor, but he discovered that animals could be trained basically or conditioned to salivate not only when they were presented with meat, which naturally produces salivation in animals, but also when they would hear a bell right before they got the meat or the food. And you can click here to watch the video on Pavlov's research. With operant conditioning, Watson was one of the huge researchers in this type of learning, and he actually shaped a fear response in Little Albert. He's famous for that. At the end of this, Little Albert, this poor little child, was scared of everything white and fuzzy. Skinner boxes are often used in research where an animal, usually a pigeon, is inside a cage with a lever and will press the lever to get some kind of a reward or reinforcement like food. A reinforcement is something that will hopefully increase the behavior in the future, and a punishment will hopefully decrease the behavior in the future. Here are the contributions of behaviorism. Exposure therapy and systematic desensitization are both therapeutic techniques used to treat phobias. Behavioral therapeutic techniques are also used to treat anxiety and to help with weight loss. Behavioral modification is something where basically you conduct an experiment of sorts on yourself. You want to stop unwanted behaviors, so you'll come up with a plan. You'll outline the rewards and punishments that will take place depending on how you behave, in hopes that you'll be able to change your behavior. Very often people will sign a behavioral modification contract, pledging to try and work toward changing their behavior. These BMODs, or behavioral modification contracts, are used quite often with autistic children or with intellectually impaired individuals. Humanism, Carl Rogers was a big humanistic theorist and counselor, and he promoted what he termed unconditional positive regard, that you unconditionally give people positivity and that will allow them to achieve great things. He also promoted the idea of active listening, which I'm sure y'all have all heard that phrase, active listening. Maslow is best known for his hierarchy of needs. Humanists in general focus on the potential in people. They didn't want to, as Freud did, look at the problems or dysfunction. They looked at what people could do if just given a little bit of support. They believe that the individual controls his or her own destiny. And so in therapy, the individual client directed the therapy completely. Here's Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's actually a 6th level that's often studied now, and it's called self-transcendence. You don't see it depicted here, but that is included in a lot of the literature. Self-actualization, or being self-actualized, basically just means that you become the best version of yourself that you could be. People who are self-actualized are very confident. They're able to have peak experiences of joy and insight, and they live life to the fullest. Critics of humanism believe that they were way too focused on your internal thoughts. That can confuse things, and we're not always sure about accurate interpretations of what goes on in your mind. They also thought that it's not so rigid as these stages. Stage theories, by the way, imply that you have to go in the order. So on this stage model, you would start at the bottom with physiological needs. You have to meet your basic needs for food and water before you can move up to safety needs, and then before you can move up to love and belongingness. You can't skip stages. You have to go through the whole thing in order. And critics think that it's not so fixed. People like Gandhi actually starved themselves as a way of showing their political beliefs. Other critics think that rather than self-actualizing being the top, or even self-transcendence being the top, it should be that at the top of the pyramid is finding and keeping a mate and then parenting. Cognitivists, they're looking at what's going on in the mind. They study things like perception, thinking, memory, problem solving, and language. Cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is one of the best treatment methods we know of today to treat a wide variety of problems. And that's a combination of what the cognitivists had to say along with the behaviorists. Jean Piaget is one of the best-known cognitivists, and he was also a developmental psychologist. Before he came along, people thought that children were just miniature adults, but Piaget made us understand that children are not the same as adults. They're not capable of certain levels of thought, and they think differently. All people develop schemas. That's just his word to describe a cognitive structure or something that you understand about something. An organized representation of a concept is a schema. Disequilibrium happens whenever you're presented with something that goes outside of what your already formed schema is. So, for example, if a kid thinks that dog is a chihuahua because that's their family's dog. It's a little chihuahua. When the kid sees another chihuahua, it's easy to just assimilate that into the schema of dog because those are two chihuahuas that look very similar. That's easy to just absorb that in. But if it's a bloodhound or a huge dog, a Doberman, that doesn't necessarily fit the preformed schema that was a chihuahua, and that causes disequilibrium, meaning imbalance. And that requires the person to accommodate the new dog, the Doberman or the bloodhound, with the original schema, to change the schema to accommodate both to be dogs. Once that happens, then you re-achieve equilibrium or balance. And people constantly go, especially children who are just learning about their worlds, constantly switch back and forth between disequilibrium and equilibrium. 4 stages are involved in Piaget's cognitive theory. Understand each of these 4 stages and what happens during each of them. There's also a discussion board option on this. There are limitations and capabilities of children at each stage. There are different abilities and constraints at each stage. And there's lots of vocabulary terms you need to learn for each of these. So really pore over this in the textbook. Piaget's critics thought that it's not that fixed or orderly. He again has a stage theory that it doesn't happen so fixed. Piaget also, we now know today, that he underestimated the capabilities of younger children. He also didn't consider females or other cultures. Social learning theory, which is also called cognitive learning theory, was really promoted largely by Albert Bandura and all of his research in observational learning or social learning. Or in the book, it's called cognitive learning. He talked about modeling, that we model behaviors we see from models or mentors. And there's a Bobo doll experiment that's famous. You can read about it or Google it for more information. But basically, young children copied exactly the aggressive behaviors they had seen adults doing. Critics of cognitivism point to the fact that it's not age-specific, but development definitely is influenced by how old we are at the developmental period. They also criticize the fact that because it's so focused on our thoughts and emotions and internal processes, that it's open to lots of misinterpretation. It's also hard to implement with kids who are either pre-verbal or just learning how to speak. Vygotsky came up with a Sociocultural Theory, and in it he says that social interactions are how we learn, and we're capable of more with a mentor, someone with a little bit more experience than we have, or not necessarily older, but just more experience. He believed that we cannot be separated from our culture, that our environment and our culture definitely impacts our learning, and vice versa, our learning impacts our environment. When and where the person was born impacts development. Vygotsky also heavily studied a culture's tools, like language. Bronfenbrenner's Ecological Model was also covered in Chapter 1, so be sure to read about it in both chapters. He believed that the environment and the individual cannot be separated. The two interact way too much. So rather than trying to look at them as individual components, the environment and the person, you need to look at the process of development. And there are very complicated interactions that explain people's individual differences. The chronos system was added later, and that's the passage of time, or effect of time. As an example, you might feel differently about rape after you yourself have been raped, or maybe a friend of yours is raped. In the eclectic approach, this basically asserts that there's no one best theory or treatment, and that is true. There's no proven treatment that cures everything. So most therapists and clinicians will choose whatever best fits the person and the situation. That's the eclectic approach. Continuity basically means that development occurs in a smooth, slow, and steady pace. It's also known as the mechanistic model. Discontinuity means that development happens suddenly, immediately upon reaching a stage. That's called the organismic model. Stage theories, such as many of those that we've talked about today, would fall under this category of discontinuity. Behavior geneticists point to genes to potentially explain differences you see in people and their development. Kagan is well known for his research in behavioral inhibition. Behavioral inhibition goes way beyond just shyness, although it does include being shy. But BI kids will also avoid new experiences at all costs. They exhibit a high stress response, and we know that BI is highly heritable, meaning you get it from your genes, from your parents and ancestors. Twin studies, especially those of separated identical twins who were raised by different families, have helped us understand a lot about what traits are heritable. For example, the Minnesota Twin Project showed us that leadership and sociability are highly heritable, while obedience and discipline are much less heritable. Evolutionary psychology was basically promoted by Charles Darwin. He's the one who came up with that survival of the fittest theory that y'all have probably studied in other classes. He believed in the universality of human nature. Evolutionary psychologists study changes that occur over generations. Ethology is actually the study of animals, and it's how we apply knowledge of animals to humans. That's ethology. We know that being born with an oversized head and big eyes, just like humans and many animals, is cute, and that inspires care among the older members of the society. That ensures survival. Human beings have almost an irrational need to stop a baby from crying. That helped those babies survive because cries indicate the baby needs something. Conrad Lawrence studied animals, usually birds like ducks, and discovered something he termed imprinting. And imprinting is sort of like an attachment. Imprinting only occurs in animals. It does not happen with humans. But what it is it's an irreversible bond that happens almost immediately upon birth, like within a few hours. There are a lot of tractors on farms that have become mommy to little chicklets. Lawrence's research showed us that there are critical periods for development, meaning if something doesn't happen in that critical period of time, it will never happen. We know that there's a critical period for the development of language. If you don't learn language or see it signed by the age of about 10, maybe even before that, like 7, some people say, you will never be able to communicate by using language. We no longer talk about nature versus nurture. That's a long-held question in psychology. It's not really which or even how much of each are involved. Rather, it's how they interact, because it's really both nature, your genes, and nurture, your environment, the social culture that you're in, that interact to form you and influence your development.